My wife decided to play games with me by cheating on me. I found out and also decided to play along with her by punishing her. Here's how it went. I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped into the house. It wasn't the typical exhaustion from a long day of work. It was a stillness in the air that prickled my skin. You know that feeling when the world seems slightly off? That was it. But nothing seemed out of place. The house was quiet. My wife, Laura, was in the living room, legs tucked beneath her, pretending to scroll through her phone. She didn't even look up as I walked in. "Hey," I said, dropping my bag by the door. "Everything okay?" She nodded, too quickly. "Yeah, just tired." Her voice was light, but her body was rigid. I brushed it off. Long day, I figured. I moved toward the bedroom to change, and that's when I noticed the diary. It was sitting on her nightstand, slightly ajar, like someone had been in a hurry. My heart started racing. Laura never left her journal out like that. It was her most private possession. She told me once that she wrote down everything in there. Her thoughts, her feelings, her secrets. I hesitated. I'm not the kind of guy to invade someone's privacy. But something about the way she'd been acting lately, the late nights at work, the unexplained texts she'd brushed off, it gnawed at me. I told myself I wouldn't open it. I'd just straighten it and move on. But as I reached out, I saw my name written on the open page. Michael. My name, circled, underlined, followed by a name I didn't recognize, Brad. The words beneath it weren't a casual note or reminder. They were paragraphs. Descriptions. Moments. My stomach churned. I didn't mean to read it, but my eyes betrayed me, darting over the words. Brad makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. The air felt like it had been punched out of my lungs. Brad. I didn't know a Brad. Who was Brad? And what was he making my wife feel? I put the diary back exactly as I found it, my hands shaking. She was still downstairs. I could hear the faint sound of the TV, laughter from some sitcom that clashed violently with the storm building in my chest. I needed to confront her. But as I stood there, my mind flipped like a switch. No, not yet. I didn't want a confrontation. I wanted a plan. I sat in the bedroom, the silence deafening, trying to steady my breathing. My mind raced with questions, each one more cutting than the last. Who was Brad? How long had this been going on? Was it emotional, physical, or both? I needed answers, but I knew I couldn't just barge in and ask her outright. I needed to figure out the full picture before confronting her. If this was true, and it sure seemed like it was, I wasn't going to give her the chance to twist the narrative. I'd seen enough stories from guys who went in blind, only to be made the bad guy somehow. Not me. The first step was getting the proof. If the diary was the key, I had to go deeper, but I couldn't do it with her just downstairs. So I waited. I sat there, pretending to read a book, all the while my ears tuned to the faint sounds of her moving around below. After an hour or so, she called out, "Heading to bed soon?" "Yeah, just finishing up," I replied, trying to sound normal, casual. She didn't reply. A few minutes later, I heard the water running, her bedtime ritual starting. Perfect. Once the lights in the bedroom went out and her soft, steady breathing filled the room, I slipped back into the living room. The diary was still where I'd found it earlier. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. There it was, page after page of entries about Brad. Some were short, just passing mentions, but others were detailed. Too detailed. Descriptions of stolen moments, late-night conversations, feelings she didn't think she could share with me anymore. One entry hit me like a brick. If only Michael knew the real me. Brad sees it. He loves it. He doesn't judge. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the diary tighter. This wasn't just some passing fling. She'd built something with this guy. Something that, to her, seemed real. But the kicker? She had no idea I'd ever know. Every word on the page was raw, honest, and without filters. She trusted this diary like a confidant. And then the last entry stopped me cold. I wish I had the courage to tell Michael the truth. He deserves it. But I can't. I need to end it with Brad. It's gone too far. Tomorrow, I'll break it off. My jaw clenched. She was planning to end it? Now? After everything? I wasn't sure if that made me angrier or more confused. What? Was I supposed to just pretend none of this happened if she called it off? That's when I decided. I wasn't going to confront her yet. No, I needed to take this up a notch. If she wanted secrets, I could play that game too. The next morning, I woke up before her, a rare occurrence. Usually, Laura was the early bird, always up and about before I even had my first cup of coffee. But today, she stayed curled up in bed, her face peaceful, as if she wasn't harboring this enormous secret. I stared at her for a moment, trying to reconcile the woman I married with the one who wrote those words. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "You're up early," she mumbled, her voice groggy. "Couldn't sleep," I said, forcing a smile. "Got a lot on my mind." She nodded, but I caught the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Was she thinking about her plan to end things with Brad? I wondered if she even felt guilty, or if her guilt was only about being caught. "I'll make breakfast," she offered, throwing back the covers. I watched her leave the room, feeling a mix of anger and sadness that churned in my gut. Part of me wanted to scream at her right then, to demand an explanation, but I held back. No, I needed time. If she thought today was just another ordinary day, I'd have the upper hand. After she left for work, I got to work too. My plan was simple. I wasn't just going to sit around and wait for her to come clean. I was going to make her sweat. If she thought ending things with Brad was going to absolve her of all the deceit, she had another thing coming. Step 1. Dig deeper. I wasn't proud of it, but I started with her phone. I knew her password. She wasn't exactly discreet about it. The messages were sparse. Most were deleted, but there were a few breadcrumbs. Text from a B that said things like, "Last night was amazing," and "You looked incredible yesterday." Nothing incriminating on their own, but paired with what I'd read in the diary, it painted a pretty clear picture. I scrolled through her emails next. There was a reservation confirmation for a cozy little restaurant across town from a few weeks ago. The kind of place we never went to because she said it was too fancy. My stomach tightened. Was that one of their rendezvous spots? The thought of her there, dressed up for someone else, made me feel physically ill. Step 2. I had to get ahead of her. I didn't just want answers. I wanted to see how far she'd go to cover her tracks. That's when I came up with the idea. I'd create a scenario that would force her hand. A prank, sure, but one that would let me see her true colors. I started small that day. Nothing overt, just subtle hints to make her wonder if I knew something. When she came home that evening, I casually mentioned, "Hey, I found your diary while I was tidying up. Didn't know you still kept one." Her reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath, her eyes darting to the bedroom. "Oh, yeah. Just old habits, you know," she stammered. "Anything interesting in there?" I asked, watching her closely. Her cheeks flushed. "No, just random thoughts. It's nothing, really." She was lying. I could see it in the way she fiddled with the hem of her shirt, her voice a little too high-pitched. It was working. She thought I might know something, but not enough to accuse her outright. That night, I waited until she fell asleep, and then I put the next part of my plan into action. If she wanted to live in a web of lies, I was about to tangle her up in it. The following day, I set my plan into full motion. Step 3. Plant the seed of doubt. If Laura thought she could keep secrets, I'd make her question everything. I started with her car. She always parked in the same spot in our driveway, so before she left for work, I placed a small, unassuming envelope under her windshield wiper. Inside was a blank piece of paper, nothing written on it, just enough to make her curious. I knew she'd find it on her lunch break, and the lack of any explanation would drive her nuts. Next, I called her at work. She sounded distracted when she picked up, her usual cheery tone strained. "Hey, everything okay?" she asked, probably worried I'd stumbled onto something. "Yeah, just wanted to hear your voice," I said casually. "You seemed a little off this morning." "Oh, no. I'm fine," she said quickly, but I could hear the tension in her voice. She was unraveling, just a little. "All right," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Have a good day, babe." I spent the rest of the day laying breadcrumbs. A folded napkin with a lipstick smudge left strategically on the dining table, one I knew wasn't hers. A cryptic note in my own handwriting tucked into her bedside drawer. "It's amazing what people confess when they think no one is listening." It wasn't a direct accusation, but it was enough to plant a seed. By the time she got home, she looked frazzled. Her eyes darted around the room as if she were piecing together some invisible puzzle. Did you leave something on my car today?" she asked, her voice casual, but the nervous edge gave her away. "What do you mean?" I asked, feigning confusion. "There was an envelope on my windshield," she said, watching me closely. "Nothing inside, though." "Huh. Weird," I replied with a shrug. "Maybe just some kid playing a prank." Her brow furrowed, but she didn't push further. She was spiraling, and I wasn't about to give her any reassurance. That night, I watched her more closely than ever. She was fidgety, checking her phone every few minutes and glancing toward her diary on the nightstand, as if it might burst into flames. As she drifted off to sleep, I knew the final phase of my plan was ready. If she thought the little hints were unnerving, she wasn't prepared for what I had in store next. Because tomorrow, I wasn't just going to make her question what I knew. I was going to make her question everything she thought she could hide. The next morning, I could tell Laura barely slept. Her eyes were puffy, and she kept biting her lip like she was holding something in. Perfect. The trap was tightening, and she didn't even realize it. As soon as she left for work, I moved to step 4, the diary. I knew she'd check it eventually, so I decided to leave her a little surprise. Carefully, I wrote on a blank page near the end of the journal, "Secrets don't stay buried forever." I didn't stop there. I placed a folded slip of paper between 2 earlier entries, the ones about Brad. On it, I wrote, "You think he doesn't know?" I made sure to use her handwriting style, just enough to make her doubt if she'd written it herself. I could almost hear her panicking already. When she came home that evening, she was quieter than usual, her eyes darting to her diary like it had become a ticking time bomb. I waited, pretending to read a book on the couch, while she eventually slipped into the bedroom. 5 minutes passed. 10. I could hear the faint rustle of paper, the sound of pages flipping faster than someone casually reading. Then, silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. She came out a few moments later, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Did you look at my diary?" she asked, her voice trembling. I glanced up, feigning confusion. "Your diary?" "No." "Why?" She hesitated, searching my face for any sign of deceit. "No reason," she mumbled, then quickly excused herself to the kitchen. I heard her open the fridge, then the unmistakable sound of a bottle of wine being uncorked. I smiled to myself. She was unraveling faster than I thought. Over dinner, I let the tension build. She was quieter than usual, barely touching her food, her mind clearly elsewhere. Finally, I leaned back in my chair and said casually, "You know, it's funny how people think they can hide things forever. The truth always comes out in the end." Her fork clattered onto her plate, her face snapping up to meet mine. For a second, she looked like she might say something. Confess, maybe. But she just swallowed hard and muttered, "Yeah, I guess so." I stood and started clearing the dishes, leaning just close enough to her as I walked by to murmur, "I hope you're ready for that." Her eyes widened, her hands trembling as she clutched her glass. I could see the storm brewing inside her, and I had to fight back the grin tugging at my lips. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Because tomorrow, Laura wasn't just going to question her secrets. She was going to wish she'd never kept them in the first place. The next day, I took the final steps to push Laura over the edge. She left for work as usual, though her movements were more hesitant, her eyes constantly flicking toward me like she expected me to say something. I didn't. I let her stew in her own thoughts, knowing it would only add to the pressure. Once she was gone, I got to work. I crafted a fake email and set it to be sent from an anonymous address. The subject line was simple: what he knows. Inside, I wrote, "Your husband deserves the truth. He's not as clueless as you think." Then I attached a photo, a stock image of a couple holding hands, blurry enough to suggest it might be her and Brad. It wasn't, of course, but it didn't need to be. The seed of doubt was all that mattered. I set the email to send around noon, ensuring she'd be at her desk when it arrived. Then I prepared the real piece to resistance. I drove to the restaurant where her and Brad's dinner reservation had been made weeks ago. A quick call pretending to be Laura, claiming to need a copy of the receipt for expense purposes, was all it took to get the staff to send it to her personal email. I knew she'd see it and panic. There was no way she'd think it was a coincidence. By the time she got home, she was a wreck. Her hair was disheveled, and she walked in like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She barely glanced at me as she muttered a weak, "Hey," and headed straight to the bedroom. I gave her space, knowing the next move was hers. About an hour later, I heard her voice, soft, almost pleading. "Michael, can we talk?" I walked into the bedroom, keeping my face neutral. "What's up?" I asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched in her lap. Have you been reading my emails?" she asked, her voice shaking. I raised an eyebrow. Why would I do that? Her gaze flicked to the floor, and she bit her lip. "I don't know. It's just, weird things are happening. I got an email today, and it felt personal." I folded my arms, letting the silence stretch. Finally, I said, "Personal, huh? Like what?" She fidgeted, her cheeks reddening. It mentioned you. And in someone else." "Someone else?" I repeated, tilting my head. "That's interesting. Why would someone email you about that?" She didn't answer, but her face crumpled. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she finally blurted out, "Michael, I need to tell you something." I stayed silent, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. She was about to admit everything. "I've been keeping something from you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. And I've been trying to fix it, I swear." I took a step closer, my face unreadable. "What are you talking about, Laura?" Her voice cracked as she choked out, "There's someone else. His name is Brad." I stared at her for a long moment, letting her words hang in the air. Then I leaned in, just close enough for her to see the cold steel in my eyes. "Laura," I said, my voice steady, "do you really think I didn't already know?" Her face went pale, and her breath hitched. You knew?" "Oh," I said, straightening up and walking toward the door. "I knew. The question is, what are you going to do now?" Laura sat frozen, her face pale as if the blood had drained from her entirely. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, waiting. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of her uneven breathing. I don't know what to say," she finally stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Say the truth," I replied calmly. "Every detail. No more lies. No more hiding. Start from the beginning. Her hands trembled as she reached for the edge of the bed, like it could somehow steady her. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she began, her voice cracking. Brad. He was just someone I could talk to. It started with that, just talking. I didn't mean for it to go further. And yet, I said, stepping closer, it did. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded. It did. But it wasn't what you think, Michael. I swear, I didn't mean to hurt you. I clenched my fists, fighting back the rising tide of anger. You didn't mean to hurt me? I said, my voice sharp. Laura, you wrote about him in your diary. You had secret dinners, exchanged God knows how many texts, and called him the person who makes you feel alive. And you think it wasn't going to hurt me? Her sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands. I'm sorry, she choked out. I ended it. I swear, I ended it before it went too far. Too far? I snapped. What does that even mean, Laura? Did you kiss him? Did you sleep with him? What does too far mean to you? She hesitated, her sobs faltering. We kissed, she admitted, but it didn't go beyond that. I swear, Michael, I couldn't do it. I stopped it. I studied her carefully. Was she telling the truth now? Or was this just another attempt to salvage what little ground she thought she had left? You expect me to believe that? I asked, my tone cold. After everything you've hidden, you think you still have the right to my trust? She reached out as if to touch me, but I stepped back. The gesture seemed to break her further. I'll do anything, she said desperately. Anything to fix this. Just tell me how to fix it. Her words hung in the air, her tear-streaked face a picture of regret. But I wasn't ready to give her that relief. Not yet. You want to fix this? I asked, my voice calm but firm. Then you're going to hear exactly how this feels. You're going to live with the truth for once. Her eyes widened, panic flickering in them. What do you mean? You'll see soon enough, I said, my voice steady. I'm not letting this go, Laura. Not until you understand what it's like to lose the trust you thought would always be there. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to sit in her despair. My mind was spinning, my heart racing, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over yet. The house felt heavy that night, like the walls themselves were pressing in on us. Laura didn't come out of the bedroom after our conversation. I didn't check on her. Instead, I sat in the living room, staring at nothing in particular, letting the anger simmer just below the surface. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The next day, I left for work as usual, though usual was a distant memory now. I knew Laura would stay home. She'd been shaken to her core, and that was exactly what I wanted. She needed to feel the weight of what she'd done, not just brush it off with a few tears and empty apologies. But that wasn't the end. I had one last card to play. That evening, I came home carrying a small, plain box. She was in the kitchen, her hair disheveled and her eyes red from crying. She looked up when I walked in, searching my face for some sign of where we stood. I didn't give her one. What's that? She asked quietly, motioning to the box. Sit, I said, gesturing to the dining table. My tone left no room for argument. She obeyed, her hands twisting nervously in her lap as I set the box in front of her. For a moment, I just stood there, watching her squirm under the pressure. Then, slowly, I opened the box and pulled out its contents. First, her diary. I placed it on the table with deliberate care, the pages fanned slightly as if it were waiting to tell its secrets. Her eyes widened, but she said nothing. Next, I laid out the restaurant receipt, the one she thought was buried in her email. Recognize this? I asked, my voice calm but icy. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. I continued. And this? I held up my phone, showing her a copy of the email I'd sent from the anonymous account. Her face went pale, and she looked like she might be sick. Michael, she started, but I cut her off. No, I said sharply. You don't get to talk. Not yet. You're going to listen. I pulled out the final piece, a handwritten letter. My letter. I'd written it the night before, pouring out every ounce of anger, pain, and betrayal I felt. It wasn't a love letter. It was a truth bomb. A detailed account of what her actions had done to me, to us, to everything we'd built together. I set it in front of her and leaned in, my face inches from hers. You wanted to know how to fix this? Start by reading that. Out loud. Her hands trembled as she picked up the letter, her eyes scanning the first few lines. Tears streamed down her face as she began to read, her voice cracking with every word. She flinched at the rawness of my words, at the vivid way I described the pain she'd inflicted. But she kept going, her sobs growing louder with each sentence. When she finally finished, she looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't realize. No, you didn't, I said coldly. But now you do. I stood there for a moment, letting her words hang in the air. Then I straightened, my expression unyielding. Here's how this is going to work. You're going to pack a bag tonight. I've arranged for you to stay at a hotel for a while. I need space, Laura. And so do you. Her eyes widened, fresh tears spilling over. Michael, please. Don't do this. This isn't about what you want anymore, I said firmly. It's about what I need. And right now, I need to be away from you. I turned and walked toward the door, pausing just long enough to deliver my final words over my shoulder. This isn't over, Laura. But when I decide what happens next, you'll know. Until then, think about what you've done. Every single day. I left her sitting there, broken and sobbing, with nothing but her guilt and my words to keep her company.